Welcome to Smart Brown Voices, your weekly podcast featuring diverse voices from around the world, giving you insights on how others made it big in their respective fields. Now sit back, grab a notebook, and get ready to be inspired. And don't forget to use hashtag #SmartBrownVoices to share insights, moments of wisdom, and things from the show that inspire you. And now, here's your host, social media nerd and technology activist, Mr. Mike Street.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 82 of Smart Brown Voices. We're getting closer to our 100th episode. We're only 18 episodes away from episode 100. Thank you guys so much for listening to the show. Send me your emails and tweets. We've been getting tons of requests to be guests on the show. So if you want to be on the show and share your knowledge and inspire our community, send me an email at streetforce1, STREETFORCE, the number 1 at gmail.com. So today we have an exciting guest on, and I'm just really happy to talk to her because it's actually a topic that I have enjoyed many years because I'm a big fan of the movie Daughters of the Dust by Julie Dash. And I'm excited to talk with Melissa L. Cooper. Melissa, welcome to Smart Brown Voices. You have a new book that's about to come out. Tell us all about it.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael. I'm very excited to talk to you as well. My book, Making Gullah, A History of Sapelo Islanders, Race, and the American Imagination, is basically a history of ideas that uses Sapelo Island as a case study. And so what I research and grapple with in the book is how outsiders have kind of constructed and made the Gullah identity from the 20s and 30s till about the present day, researchers and fiction writers. And I was really interested in how these different groups imagine Sapelo Islanders and Gullah folks' African connection, sort of the legacy of those connections and how those ideas changed over time.
So let's take a step back. And so for our listeners who aren't familiar or who have never seen Daughters of the Dust, because I think that's kind of everybody's introduction to this culture, can you give us kind of an overview of what Gullah culture is all about? Because to me, it's very fascinating and interesting.
Yeah, so one of the things that I am working through and unpacking in the book is sort of exactly what is Gullah culture. By the time we get to Daughters of the Dust, ideas about the Gullah have changed so much from the 1920s and 30s. So if I had to sort of boil it down to some core characteristics, the Gullah have been identified largely as Black communities in the South Carolina and Georgia Lowcountry. They've been distinguished by their, particular speech and dialect, and the fact that they have retained some traditions from their African ancestors. So that's the popular sort of understanding. But what I found in my research is some of that changed over time in the way that people understood and even imagined those characteristics also changed over time, largely in relation to other ideas that were circulating in the popular culture.
And so the Gullah culture has been in the news recently because of land ownership. And with the Gullah culture, the land is very communal and they're passing the land, from generation to generation. But, the government or, opportunists, have come in and have been trying to take a lot of that land away. So talk to us a little bit about what you kind of discovered around that.
Well, what's interesting is just even sort of the idea that, that land is communal and passed down in my work is sort of another example of the ways that some ideas about the Gullah have been kind of constructed so that they're a little bit more romantic and quaint and not really grounded in realities like I start my study in the 20s and 30s. This is the height of Jim Crow America. These aren't Blacks who were living a picturesque existence on, these islands that dot the seacoast in the Lowcountry. These are Blacks who are struggling through Jim Crow. So we have to ask questions like, are people just passing down land in family groups without heavy legal language coded in wills because it's their cultural preference? Or what role does Jim Crow play in this? Access to lawyers on the mainland, the money involved with actually, designating and setting up land trusts for generations using tools that are recognized in the United States, right? Like as important legal tools to preserve wealth. So one of the things that I argue and look at in my work is the ways that some of the stories that we've told about the Gullah have kind of overshadowed their very real struggle as Black Southerners throughout time. And so when we wind up here at this moment where property rights and land loss are a really defining conversation about Gullah communities, it's important for us to look back and try to figure out how we got there, right? And these predatory land grabs and some of the practices that are threatening family properties have deep roots in a much older system that involved economic exploitation of Black folk. So the air property crisis is a really sort of detrimental reality that's had a very negative impact on Black land retention in the Lowcountry, right? So people who pass down property without a will or, stating how this land is to be divided and or maintained over time. As each generation, a new generation is born, the number of heirs who are entitled to this land balloons. And because of the Great Migration and all of those push and pull factors that have moved Blacks from the South to the North and cities in the West over generations, these descendants are scattered across the nation. And so you have a situation where you have plots of land that are not big enough to divide across several descendants, right? And then you also have a situation where there are some land speculators and people who position themselves to buy interest in air property, enticing heirs with the promise of readily available cash for land if they would sell their interest in the property. And then these people sometimes wage claims in court saying, we'd like to liquidate the assets, knowing that it will go up for auction, right? And then sometimes family groups have trouble paying the taxes and or all of the other fees that are associated with maintaining land ownership. So land is being lost in a variety of different ways, forced land sales, et cetera. But they all go back to, we have to ask questions about what was the relationship between these Blacks and Jim Crow South and the legal systems that would protect their land. So those are issues. And those issues are magnified when we think about how valuable coastal property has become over time. A colleague of mine wrote a very important book, The Land Was Ours, Andrew Carl, about these questions of coastal property and how that's changed. So I think what I try to do is rejoin the realities of Black life in a community like Sapelo and some of the stories and some of the fantasies about their lives in cultural worlds that have traditionally been separated.
Mm-hmm. So do you feel like, looking at something like A Daughters of the Dust romanticized this culture a little too much without kind of giving some of the realities of like what's really happening? Because as you talk about like having a proper will that's on paper, that's, extremely important because if things come up in court and you have nothing, to really show that's like technically documented, then we have the issue that a lot of these people are facing now.
Yeah, and the issues that they're facing with regard to holding on to land in Lowcountry and Black communities is really layered.
Mm-hmm.
Everything from rising property values and rising taxes, and just they're layered, right? But so works like Daughters of the Dust, at least in my book, I dedicate a chapter to the Black women writers who helped to who are really influential in the Gullah revival, right? So, like how our generation learned about the Gullah, well, for most people, how they sort of first discovered Gullah folk. I understand these women to be important curators and sort of saviors of the way that we can understand the importance of this particular quote unquote identity to the larger Black identity. And while what they do is, of course, because a lot of my work is about looking at how these ideas change over time and how they're connected to other ideas that are popular at the moment. These women are writing about the Gullah in the wake of the Black Studies movement, when people know more about Africa, when they know more about Black history, when there's a complete sort of change in how we are asking people to engage with Black history in the academy. So they're, like many scholars and researchers, are digging back to the material that was written during the 20s and 30s and finding these little gems and jewels. However, the gems and jewels that they found from the 20s and 30s were problematic. And sometimes they were really racist. They really depicted Blacks in the Lowcountry as being primitive and backward. And, African survivals were little more than, the mental antiques of, a primitive people. So when they dig back into that material to kind of understand who Gullah people are, they're reading from works that have excluded all this Jim Crow, right, from the story. So when you go to imagine these islands off the coast of South Carolina or Georgia, just by looking at what was written in the 20s and the 30s, you're not going to get stories about like on Sapelo, the white millionaires who took up residence and really grabbed for property all over the island. And you're not going to get those stories because the researchers and writers who were going to the island during the 20s and 30s weren't looking for that. Mm-hmm. They weren't looking to confront Jim Crow. They weren't looking to record the travails and sort of horrors of Black life in the South. So what they left behind was devoid of that sort of material. And that's what I try to reinsert. So these Black women writers are in all writing as fiction artists. They're not compelled to create quote unquote accurate portrayals. But what they do is they build their stories about Gullah folk based on what's there. And they also insert into those stories a different spin, right? These Blacks are not primitive or backwards. The things that they have held on to were important for the survival of the Black South, right? A real different take on African survivals. So I am not necessarily hard on these women for the things that are not reflected in their fictional works. Because I'm charting more so how the imagination is shaped and influenced by the things that we miss, the things that we know, the things that are popular in the larger culture, right? So I'm reading it that way, and instead of sort of making hard determinations about what should have been in the story.
And so after people finish reading, reading Making Gullah, what do you really want them to walk away with?
Well, I'd like them to walk away with a much more complicated understanding of how we imagine and characterize race and cultural difference. I mean, it's still a concept that's really at the heart of so many tensions in American life today. So, I think that one of the things that the book does is it gives us sort of a strategy for understanding these stories that we tell about race and cultural difference. I also would hope that readers would walk away with a better understanding of it, like the history of Gullah communities. While I am only using Sapelo Island as a case study, I do think that there's some big themes in the book relative to Sapelo that can also be linked to other Gullah communities. And so I'd like people to think about the history of Jim Crow and racism and the legacy of Jim Crow racism and Jim Crow economics on these communities, especially when we think about land loss in these communities today, right? And I think one of the other things that I hope that readers will come away with and really sit and think about is the questions that this history raises about land rights. And by that I mean, for generations, groups like Sapelo Islanders have been celebrated for their connection to their slave past and to their African past. And we have to start entertaining the question, perhaps, of what's owed to them as a result of this connection. Should we just celebrate it in terms of, the material products, the sweetgrass baskets, and the hand-woven fishnets and Gullah cuisine and the dialect, or should we also be thinking, what does it mean that there are people in this country who've been celebrated for the straight line that they can link back to their enslaved African ancestors at the same time that they're losing land? What's owed? So those are some of the takeaways I hope that readers will get from the book.
Awesome. Well, your book hits the stores on April 17th, and I want all of our listeners to go out and read it, because I think it's definitely going to be a fascinating read. I love, this culture and learning more about it. So thank you so much for putting out this important book, and especially during this times where, we see little inklings of the Gullah culture kind of being, co-opted in pop culture and certain music videos. I won't name names, but we're definitely seeing, people drawing from this culture, which has been around for a long time as, as source material for, for pop culture looks and feels. So I think your book is very timely and gives people like a complete picture of what's, what this community is really about. So thank you for putting that out.
No, thank you so much for having me.
And so let everyone know where they can buy the book, and then also how they can follow you across the web.
Well, the book is available at all of the major book distributors, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It's published by the University of North Carolina Press. You can even purchase it on their site. It's in the Kindle format, paperback, hardcover, etc. So it'll be widely available. I'm using all of those venues on April 17th. And I am on Twitter. My handle is Historian Cooper. So your audience can feel free to follow me on Twitter and keep up with all of the new events and things that I will be doing surrounding the book.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being a smart and brown voice in this community and sharing everything that's been going on. All right, guys. Thank you,
Michael.
No problem. All right, guys. So that was episode 82. Thank you so much for joining us on this, our 82nd episode. Like I said, if you want to be on the show, send me an email at streetforce1@gmail.com. And, tell me your story, send me your headshot, and we'll make it happen. So again, thanks again to all of our listeners. And like I said, so in the 90s, so when we hit episode 90, we're going to be bringing back our top 10 favorite guests from our previous episodes. So I'm working to get like John Henry back, Paul Brinson, everyone else, because we want to catch up with them and really kind of see, because a lot of people have, like, after being on this show, like John Henry, he's like become a major superstar. Paul Brunson's doing amazing things. We're going to have your favorite guest, which was Denitria Lewis, back on, and we're going to have a recap of Brands on Fleek. So thank you so much, and look out for those episodes coming soon.
Thanks for listening to Smart Brown Voices with your host, Mr. Mike Street. If you like what you just heard, we hope you'll leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and colleagues. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts, and make sure to follow us on social media. This has been a Mr. Mike Street production. Join us next time for another edition of Smart Brown Voices, and be inspired.